Thanks, Miles, and very nice to be here. Thanks to AIIA and also to Department of Foreign Affairs for convening this. And my congratulations to the speakers this morning. First session after lunch, never easy, and I hope that we can start and finish together. If I might say that what a great selection of topics that we've had today, but one perhaps for AIIA to consider for the publication might be one on defence diplomacy. Not military diplomacy, but defence diplomacy, which is far broader. I would say in my experience, if I was to name one of the most influential and powerful people in the Asia Pacific, it would be the Commander-in-Chief Pacific, who everybody defers to, I can assure you. And when I think about what we did in East Timor and how we were able to manage that Indonesian-Australian relationship, I would say it was the depth of the military relationship that allowed us to, I think, come through some very difficult times. Not only the military relationship, but that's where it could have got out of kilter very easily. So I think defence diplomacy is a topic that would be worthy of it. But anyway, I'm supposed to talk about civil-military diplomacy, but I'm only going to talk about one particular aspect of civil-military diplomacy, and that is this growing area which is known as security sector reform. And I've titled my paper, at least as a working title, as Strengthening Australian Diplomacy Through Security Sector Reform. Hopefully this will work. I was told if I press the button, it would definitely work. It does work. Okay, so these are the key issues, because I might only have you for a few minutes, that I want to get across. SSR is a political process, and therefore it needs to be led through diplomacy. It's now a central issue in peace and security and can't be denied or averted. Australia is extremely well placed to influence and lead on SSR based on our previous experience, and particularly in the Asia Pacific, as well as in the multinational area, multilateral area. But Australia has been reluctant to embrace the SSR concept, and it is falling behind international developments in this very, I think, dynamic area. So Australia should adopt SSR as a key policy and implement a number of key initiatives. So this is the proposed outline of the paper, which you can read, and then what I am hoping that will happen as a result of today is that you will contact me, and I'll give you my email address, and you'll ask for a copy of the paper, and then you'll provide me with some really good comments. Okay, because I've still got some time to write the paper. So just going through it very briefly. In the introduction, or the purpose of the paper, it really sets out why, or that SSR is yet to become a central plank of Australia's diplomacy. The paper explains the meaning and the nature of SSR, which isn't, I have to say, well understood here in Australia at the moment. It traces the development of SSR. It argues for Australia to strengthen its diplomatic approach, and it highlights some key initiatives. Okay, so in the first part, diplomacy is concerned primarily with promoting state national interests, and we heard all about that this morning. But we all know that the highest national interest is security and survival. So based on that, the growing importance of SSR since the end of the Cold War has really become a central focus to everybody, and it's mainly because of three reasons, at least that's what I argue. and the increased number of states that we now have in the world, many of them are extremely fragile and struggling. The proliferation of non-state actors, including some very violent ones, and the globalisation of violent criminal activity. So all of this has put greater emphasis onto SSR. Oops, gone the wrong way here. Okay, the next part of the paper just deals very briefly with security and world order and how it's transitioning, and it compares Steven Pinker's excellent, analysis of how violence has actually decreased in the world, and there's statistical evidence against that, against the unquestioned opinion of most people that there is also increased instability in the world and we're not sure what's going to happen, and a lot of concern. And it also, in this section of the paper, tries to just briefly analyse the changing nature of Australia's security environment. The fact that US and Australian interests might not always align, particularly in our nearer region, that Australia must continue to lead in its immediate neighbourhood, there won't be any choice on that. And a quote that I've just got taken out of the paper, that states that do not possess accountable and capable security institutions will struggle to survive economically and risk providing a fertile breeding ground for violent criminal and terrorist organisations. So the next part of the paper goes into explaining security sector reform, because a lot of people don't really know what it means, and there is no single agreed definition. There's many terms similar to that term security sector reform, and in the paper I explain that they all say roughly the same thing, okay? And it's like a lot of terms in international politics that if you could start on a greenfield site, you'd use a different term, and that the term security sector reform can be off-putting for some people, I know that, but it has now become so mainstream, that term, that it is the prevalent term used, so that's why I'm sticking with it. And this definition, which I'll let you read, comes from the Geneva Centre for the Democratic Control of Armed Forces, and particularly one part of that which is called the International Security Sector Advisory Team. And this, I think, is sort of the best definition or description of SSR, and it is totally consistent with the United Nations and most other main players in the field. When we talk about SSR, there's really three things we've got to consider. The functions of SSR in the security and justice sector. What are all those different functions? It's much more than train and equip military forces and police forces, which tends to be a bit of a default mechanism here in Australia. It's all about the providers, who are the providers for all of those security and justice services, and it's about the networks in between them. And overarching all of that is the accountability mechanisms to ensure that security sector reform is done properly. Now, SSR goes right through from, and this is a diagram that DCAF and ISAT kindly have provided, but this actually shows you, I think, very well the various phases of going from conflict prevention right through then to post-conflict reconstruction, and hopefully preventing a relapse into conflict, which too often, sadly, doesn't happen. And the various lines of where conflict might start, and ceasefire, and then stabilisation, and all the rest of it. And this shows you really where SSR goes throughout that spectrum, because initially, when SSR was first sort of looked at, it was really looked at in that sort of a little bit in the stabilisation phase, when you could quickly try and get some basic rule of law in place, and then develop it through the peacekeeping and the peace building and post-conflict stage. But since then, a lot of emphasis is being placed on SSR in the conflict prevention phase, because clearly, if you get the security sector institutions right, functioning properly, fully accountable, then you don't move into conflict in the first place. And that's actually what I think Australia would like to see happen. So, quite a big part of the paper, which I won't go into here, traces the development and the growing importance of security sector reform since the end of the Cold War, and the fact that it's come from two separate entities. One from the development area, which quite clearly in post-conflict reconstruction was saying we can't get anything done in sustainable development unless we have proper security institutions in place. So there was a whole pillar that came up there. And then there was the more traditional peace and security pillar, largely through the United Nations, but also by independent states. It was looking purely at the peace and conflict pillar. So they came together. And in the paper, I go through and talk about those. And a couple of things that I've yet to add to that section of the paper. One is that the US presidential directive on SSR was released a few years ago. And that was released because they found that within the various departments of the US government, they couldn't get a proper approach to it, strangely enough. And so this was seen as a civil-military approach, put it in a US presidential directive. And also I'm going to put in the paper some developments that are happening in our own region where SSR is coming really to the fore. It's coming to the fore in countries like the Philippines and also in Myanmar. But also, the country that's done SSR more than any other is Indonesia. And that provides a wonderful opportunity for which Australia can partner with Indonesia in a whole range of SSR initiatives, in my view. So, in SSR and Australian diplomacy, this is the bit of the paper that needs to be more developed. But fundamentally, I think that there is a misperception that the term SSR could jeopardise Australian diplomacy in the region. That comment has come out through a few interviews that have been done, whereas I think the reverse could be done. It's the word reform, that you could be talking to somebody about how they have to reform their security sector might not be appreciated properly. But I think there's ways around that. In Australia, the Parliament, the executive, the bureaucracy does not have a common understanding or a common language when they use SSR. So if you speak to different people from different areas and say, what's SSR, you'll get a different understanding of what it means. So that's why we need to get on one. Anyway, there's a few other issues on there, but in the interest of time, I'll really go to the chase of what I am so far recommending in the paper, and would love to hear from you guys about your thoughts on this. That's the summary of it there. But I'll just read out this section. It should only take a minute or so. So it says, these current shortcomings with Australia's approach to SSR can be easily rectified. Australia is well placed to take a leading international role in SSR, particularly in the Asia-Pacific region and more globally through the United Nations, as well as with international NGOs, such as DCAP and ISAT, that specialise in this field. Based on its positive experiences gained in Cambodia, Timor-Leste, Bougainville and the Solomon Islands, as well as lessons learned from its involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan, Australia can demonstrate considerable credibility in important aspects of SSR. As well, Australia is well placed to promote SSR by building on its recent tenure as a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council, during which time it contributed positively to matters of conflict prevention, peacekeeping and peacebuilding in areas such as policing, protection of civilians and the role of women, as well as supporting the inclusion of SSR in UN mandates. Effective SSR requires a coordinated whole-of-government approach, with strong linkages to business and NGOs operating in this space. Australia is well placed to deliver on SSR through its existing parliamentary committee procedures, its National Security Committee of Cabinet, its practice of establishing interagency task forces to address security issues, crises, and initiatives such as the establishment of the Australian Civil Military Centre and the National Security College. An increased commitment to SSR is also a cost-effective diplomatic approach. The training and provision of SSR experts is far cheaper and safer than the development of military and police advisors or contingents, and arguably provides prospects for greater host nation ownership and sustainable outcomes. SSR also provides Australia with a focused civil-military vehicle that can, firstly, help strengthen Australia's alliance with the United States and New Zealand, better enable Australia to focus its support to the United Nations in the area of peace and security, contribute positively to regional organisations such as ASEAN, some members of which require assistance with SSR and are actually trumpeting its scores, and better focus Australia's bilateral support to specific countries in the security and justice sector, and finally fostering partnerships and enhancing learning with international organisations and NGOs specialising in SSR. And then these are the 8 areas that I've flagged as specific initiatives that we could undertake, and I explain what they are. So that said, I'll just put up my email address, which you'll all take down, I'm sure, and very happy to send you a copy of the draft paper and also to get your comments. Thank you very much.